Hello and welcome back to Jog Vlogs. This is for the topic of weather hazards and climate change, and today's session is going to be looking at the negative impacts of climate change. In the last session you looked at some of the human influences of climate change. So you looked at some of the causes of that enhanced greenhouse effect, and you specifically looked at greenhouse gas emissions by things like industry and transport and agriculture, etc. Today we're actually going to start to look at addressing some of the impacts of climate change. So you've looked at the causes, and now we're going to look at what the big deal is. What are the problems associated with the rise in global temperatures? Well, the exam boards specifically focus on the negative impacts of climate change. Now, I feel like I wouldn't be a geographer if I didn't tell you that there were some positive aspects of climate change, and there are. There's a lot of projected increase in certain yields of crops in certain parts of the world, but overwhelmingly speaking, the problems of climate change are not undone by us being able to grow a little bit more rice. So there is a lot of negative impacts of climate change, and we're going to investigate some of those negative impacts. The other thing we're going to do is going to provide you with some exam technique of really extending your answers as much as we possibly can to get 4 marks when it says explain one or suggest one, which I've done in previous topics and I've done in other sessions, but this is just another bit of practice with regards to that. Okay, so once you've got the title written down, you can crack on. Now, what we've got here is a world map, and what you should be able to identify is that it's not a typical looking world map. Based on the fact that we've been talking about climate change, what do you think this map might be representing, might show us? First of all, you might have to decide to hold a normal world map up to decipher where places are. But once you've had a little look, try and work out what you think this map shows. Okay, so if you still want to think about that and you don't want me to give you the answer, please feel free to pause the screen and have a little think or a discussion with anyone that's at home with you about what it might be. Again, based on the topic of climate change, hopefully you've making a bit of a connection there. What it actually shows is the size of a country if it was proportionate to its CO2 emissions. Okay, now this is out of date currently. And actually, I'm not convinced it's the total CO2 emissions. I think this might be CO2 emissions per person or per capita, but I haven't got the exact figures here. So what you can see is that the largest country in terms of its CO2 emissions is this sort of purpley blue colour, and that's the United States of America. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that the total CO2 emissions isn't actually the most from the USA. Most of it comes from this green country, which is China. But that is not the whole picture, because China, despite producing the most CO2 emissions of any country on the planet, and quite some way higher, China also has a population higher than most places on the planet, and again, quite a large amount higher. So it's not necessarily effective or useful for us to say how many CO2 emissions a country is producing in total. It's more important for us to recognise how much CO2 is being emitted per person or per capita, we'd say in geography. So that means if you divide up all your CO2 emissions by your population, it gives you an idea of just how much individuals are emitting in terms of CO2. Now, if you did that figure, the USA would come out on top with bells on. Absolutely, categorically speaking, USA per person produces much more CO2 than anywhere near anywhere on the earth. China doesn't actually feature in the top 3 or 4 when it comes to CO2 emissions per person. Again, because its population is so big, actually, although it produces the most CO2, it doesn't do it per person. And that's because, you think about the American way, the American dream. It's, all of it involves making money and owning a fast car that burns a lot of gas and having lots of stuff, and the more energy you use, that will increase your CO2 emissions. The bigger, more gas guzzling car you drive, that will increase your CO2 emissions. The more money you've got to go on holiday abroad, that will increase your CO2 emissions. So CO2 is all about per person, really, when it comes to actually contextualizing it. But there's a big issue in terms of the fact that the places that you can see here, without just focusing on USA and China, you've also got Japan, they're a big CO2 emitter, India, and that's only going to grow. Places like Germany and France and the UK, we can't keep ourselves out of that particular negative kind of context. So you can see there are a lot of places emitting a lot of CO2, and CO2 is by far the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and we saw that in the pie charts activity we did in the last session. So I've got a few dingbats for you before I go into the main activity for today. So I will put it on the screen for about 3 seconds and then I'll reveal the answer. If you want to get it, you can pause it. Alright, this one is crop production. Crop production. Okay, crop production. I'll tell you what these mean in a moment. Have a go at this next one. Okay, this one is sea level rise. That is an artist called Sia. That's spirit level, and that's sunrise. You might not have been able to see the rise, sorry. So sea level rise. Again, why does that happen? Land ice melting and thermal expansion of water. It is worth jotting this down so you're aware of what causes sea level rise, because sea level rise in itself isn't just ice melting, it's effectively land ice melting. That's important, because ice in the sea melting makes no difference whatsoever. It's land ice that's locked up on land that's added to the sea, and that will cause the sea to rise. But by far the biggest contributor to sea level rise is something called thermal expansion. So anything warmer, particularly water, as it gets warmer, it will expand, it will get bigger, it will become more voluminous. So if you imagine if you wear jewellery, for example, I've got a wedding ring on my finger, on a hot day it's harder to take my wedding ring off because my hand has expanded, and it's expanded because of thermal expansion. So in a very similar principle anyway. So water, and you think of all the water on Earth, all the water stored in the oceans and you know the seas around the world, if all of that is thermally expanding because global temperatures are going up, then it will create a huge difference in sea level rise. Okay, right, next one. Okay, this one is retreating glaciers. R-E-T-R-E-T-I-N-G, lay, seers, more than one seer. So, retreating glaciers. Right, so what those three things had in common, crop production, sea level rise and retreating glaciers, is that they are all impacts of climate change, which hopefully you got because that's the title of this lesson. Now what I'd like to do with you guys is I'd like to try and get you to understand the difference between a kind of a basic answer and a developed answer, and I'm going to use that using this, like these little chevrons, okay, these little arrows that are all about trying to power up your performance, trying to get your level, your answer, to the best level it can possibly be. So when it comes to GCSEs, if you just give me a basic answer, if it's a good basic answer, you might get a grade 4. Okay, you might get kind of a, you get around, half marks, 45 to 50% of the marks, you probably end up with a grade 4. If you can develop that, if you can extend it a little bit, you could get a grade 5, because actually you're doing a little bit more than just saying one thing. You're actually taking that thing and expanding on it. So the example I've got on the screen here is an increase in temperature or a decrease in sunlight reduces photosynthesis. That's an impact of climate change. So you might get an increase in temperature. We know about that one. Temperatures go up. That's an impact of climate change. Tick. All right. Increase in temperature means that natural plant life biodiversity decreases. So essentially, we might get less variety of wildlife. Okay, and I've just used this as one example. So please don't feel that you don't get this one. This is just me waffling away. So increase in temperature or maybe less sunlight means that you get less biodiversity. Now that is an extended point. This means that. It tells me that I've done it. So that would be kind of grade 5 to 6 territory. Grade 6 to 7 is if you can do that even further. So actually, if we've got an increase in temperature, and less biodiversity, less species diversity, that could mean that actually other species further down the food chain are affected. So if, I don't know, there are fewer plants or a different type of plant not growing anymore, it might mean that herbivores don't have their food source, so they might die out, they might reduce their numbers. And that means that the carnivores that predate on those herbivores could also reduce their numbers, so it can affect the food chain as a whole. So increase in temperature and less sunlight, less plant biodiversity, knock-on effect on the food chain. And this shows that you are understanding that kind of chain of consequences. And what's even better is if you can then apply your knowledge to an example location. So for example, in the Amazon rainforest. That's called exemplification. And it's often something that the top candidates do. They tie in a place that really shows that they understand what they're talking about. So they're like, look, this happens, that leads to that, which leads to that, and it's happening here. And look, you can see how that put together creates a brilliant answer. That's like a paragraph in an 8-mark question, isn't it? And those are going to be what the top candidates are doing all the way along. So you will need to extend your answers, and everyone should be aiming to extend their answers at least to kind of grade 5 standard, where you don't just give me the basic, you take it a bit further. There are most of you that will be able to take it another step, or even go all the way to including an example answer or exemplification to really give yourself a chance of joining that 7, 8, 9 grade club. But look, not everyone's aiming for that, and actually you still need to work hard to get that grade 5. So I'm going to kind of give you an opportunity to practice that today with the impacts of climate change, the negative impacts of climate change being the kind of driver of that. Okay, so there is a handout on 365 which has got some starting points basically. They've got essentially a set of chevrons like this, a set of little arrows where I've begun it for you. I've got the first one done, the grade 4 answers there, and I would like you to try and see how far along the chain you can get using your own answers, your own kind of development. If you want to use the this means that, or this could lead to help you structure it, then that might help. You might not know an example, but nothing's stopping you finding out one. So this is just really to practice squeezing the most marks out of the really, really tricky questions. And again, the questions you can often get might be something like, imagine what's on the board now, on the screen now, the question would probably be something like, explain one negative impact of climate change on the environment. Okay, it's a tough question. It says explain, which means you've got to extend it, one negative impact of climate change specifically on the environment, and it's worth 4 marks. So you have to name one thing, and you've got to try and get 4 marks from it. You get 1 for naming the thing, and then you'll get the extras for expanding on it and using maybe exemplification. Alright, so the handout on 365 with the chevrons on it, these arrows, please find that, and then you can complete the task. Now, hopefully you didn't go too quickly, because the answers, or a possible answer for that task, has just appeared on the screen, and I think I jumped the gun a little bit there. So if you really want to do that task yourself, look away, close your eyes, avert your gaze and pause the screen, and then maybe turn the screen off whilst you do this assessment, or whilst you do this task, and then use the screen that I'm talking about now to actually check your answers are along the right lines. Just to clarify, you don't have to have written everything I've written here, but what I would suggest is that it's similar, and it follows that same pattern with this is the problem, this means that, this could lead to, it give me an example place. So an increase in temperature or decrease in sunlight might mean that crop productions get lower, so less food, less crop yield, leading to malnutrition. People don't have enough food to eat. This is worse in developing countries like Ethiopia, could be an example. Increase in temperature melts ice on land like Antarctica and Greenland. This means that sea levels rise. This could lead to major flooding of coastal areas, loss of tourism, loss of airports, loss of roads. This is worse in places like the Maldives or anywhere in the Indian Ocean, really. You could even mention places like East Anglia in future. In the next 100 years, that's going to be a big issue. And another one that says increase in temperature causes glaciers to melt and then retreat. This means that places can flood and then suffer water shortages in the long term. Because the good thing about glaciers is if they melt gradually, they provide water, and then in the winter they'll recharge. But if the glaciers just melt all at once, you get loads of water all at once, and then you get no water. So you get flood and then drought. And then that can lead obviously to less water for growing crops, which again affects places like India and Pakistan because of all the glacial melt in the Himalayan mountain range. So there you go. This is not a long session, but this session is absolutely critical, I would say, for exam practice when it comes to identifying ways that you can expand your answers to get those extra marks when it says explain one or suggest one for 4 marks, for 3 or 4 marks, which does appear in this topic every now and then. Alright, now that is actually the end of this session and the end of the first section of weather hazards and climate change. So what we've covered so far is the factors that cause climate change and some of the impacts around climate change, as well as identifying how climate around the world is kind of created through air circulation and oceanic circulation. As we move through into the next part of this topic, we're going to start to look at the UK's climate specifically, before we then start to look at hazards associated with climate change, including droughts and tropical cyclones. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.